Rise and Grime gamers, this is Optimus Grime here with an important announcement. The Grime has come and so have I. I may not be in my prime anymore, but I'm surely in my grime now. I'm a grime male, devouring that grime rib and sipping that grime energy to put more grime in at the grim. You don't understand the grime millionaire grime set. Let me tell you, if it was a crime to grime, I would be a free man because I don't even commit crimes. I commit grimes. I'm a criminal, okay? I get dimes for grimes. You're out there sitting on your ass while I'm out here collecting mass. You're at your 9 to 5 while my order's 95. You drive, I grime. Your girlfriend, let me guess, definitely real, just goes to another school, right? My girlfriend goes to Expedition 33. If you told me when I started this game that I would deem it worthy by the end of getting a whole individual review video for itself, instead of just leaving it as a footnote for my end of the year backlog checkpoint video, I would ask for a pack of whatever you're smoking. After all, it would most definitely provide a better experience than this uninspired derivative slog that's making me wish I was kinder to Ender Lilies in my last backlog bonfire. These were my first impressions of Grime after suffering through its first utterly disappointing couple of hours. I was so uninterested in continuing this game, in fact, that I took a break from it that early on to go play something else. Citizen Sleeper. Very good game, by the way. Played the shit out of that and finished the whole thing in just 2 days. I have a lot of thoughts on that one too that I might end up discussing in my end of the year checkpoint video. But back to Grime. I decided to give it another shot after finishing Citizen Sleeper since I was in a good mood. And the rest is history. Once it finally clicks, Grime is an overall great experience in my opinion. It's certainly not for everyone, and I'm not even sure if I would go as far as to call it one of the best in its genre like I've heard from a significant portion of its niche little fanbase, but I would definitely argue that it is underrated and deserves just as much praise and recognition as its more popular brethren like Blasphemous for the things that it does just as good or better. There are also plenty of things it does wholly differently than its brethren too, which again is unfortunately not apparent from the get-go. When it comes to Souls-likes, Metroidvanias and any crossbreeds between the two, there are some obvious design conventions to follow in order to give people what they come for. I understand that. I go into these experiences expecting and welcoming some formulaic core elements. I am very much here for the bench fires, the backtracking for secrets, the neuron activation upon unlocking a shortcut, and all that good shit. That's the stuff I sign up for, as I'm sure many people do as well. What I'm questioning is whether or not they're also signing up for the obligatory hour-long slog at the start of each of these experiences too. It's wild to me how I've seen no game in this category so far besides Bloodstained that aims to make its opening hours actually memorable for the right reasons. Maybe the Ori games if you like the very mildly playable Pixar-esque story montages they go for at the beginning, but even their first actual levels are not much different than the usual player guy waking up at or falling into a random cave somewhere and having to sluggishly beat some poor malnourished men to death that are barely even able to drag themselves on the floor, let alone pose a real threat to you. I don't know if it's an unspoken rule that we need to go through this each time or if it's actually enjoyed by the majority of players, but I still find it baffling regardless that we had not already moved on from it in 2021 when this game came out. Just like it was the case then, there's a new Souls-like and or Metroidvania coming out each day, and first impressions are everything when that's the case. There's no reason for me to stick to your game among dozens alike if the first thought that I have in my head is, oh god, it's one of these again. Guess I'll just have to fuck around in the obligatory misery cave of bore for 2 hours and see if the game gets good once it opens up after that. This is so upsetting to me because of how massively it contrasts with the mid and especially late game areas of Grime that have such striking visuals, impeccable ambiences and interesting design decisions that these aspects alone were enough to make me appreciate them even when I found others lacking in the moment. A few late game bosses are good examples of this. Usually when I don't enjoy a boss fight much mechanically, there's little its presentation or story significance can make up for it. Those aspects often merely elevate an already good fight for me rather than salvaging a bad or mediocre one. In Grime's case, there were multiple exceptions to this rule, and what probably helped was that none of them were ever unfair or bullshit to begin with, but just of the type that I personally do not care for. The types of fights that make me go, I don't know, it's a bit too weird and gimmicky for me. Not terrible, but I don't much care for it. I'll talk about them more during the later sections, but what I'm getting at here is that after having already played so many great Metroidvanias, Grime started out as something that I thought I'd quickly drop at worst or just consume like junk food at best, paying half attention to it just to keep myself busy while listening to a podcast or something in the background. I'm ashamed to admit that's how I consumed it for a while until a point came where I went, wait, this is wrong, this game doesn't deserve this treatment. I want to fully immerse myself in this now actually. I want to listen to these characters and try to follow the story. I want to soak in the ambience and let these grandiose orchestral boss themes get my blood pumping. It went from something I was considering to throw in the trash to a snack I munched on with little thought for a while, and then to a full course meal prepared with real care and thought to be savored. An experience that I realized deserved my full attention and care as well. I was so hooked on it by the end that my final session even ended at 4 AM. I ruined my sleep schedule because I could not wait another day to see its ending. This is why I began this video with such a lengthy and harsh section criticizing the beginning of a game that I otherwise like a lot. I take no joy from it, but it is an issue that cannot be overlooked. I'm not asking for a rules of nature moment for every game out there, but please, developers out there listening, whatever you do, just don't do your game's first level so ordinary and formulaic. Make it the strongest part. Break conventions. Add some spice. It's so important to give a good first impression of your game no matter how the rest of it plays out. Look at the achievement completion stats for Grime and you can see a sharp drop in the percentage after the first boss. So many have quit the game right after the cave, and I was almost one of them too, as I've said earlier. This better have been remedied in the sequel, which is coming soon. It is the single biggest problem to address, and surely the developers must have realized it as well, I hope. Let's quickly talk about performance before moving on to gameplay. This is where I need to first and foremost state that the footage you're watching does not belong to me. I did not record my own playthrough because until I was already almost done with the game, I was sure that I was not going to make a video on it. I will do my best to credit every channel from which I clipped gameplay footage down in the description. Anyways, Grime ran at a nice 60 FPS the whole way on my OLED Steam Deck with high quality textures and otherwise medium settings, with all of these boxes ticked off besides ambient occlusion. That is, except for two specific points in the game, the first of which is the second phase of the surrogate vulture boss fight. Kind of understandable since the particle effects and all the other shit going on screen kind of hits the fan a little here. The other point during which I suffered performance issues though was a specific section of the Abandoned Opus, this game's equivalent of Hollow Knight's Path of Pain, the ultimate platforming challenge it offers. I have no idea why this section in particular was suffering performance issues, but it was at least no big deal since it's not really a feast for the eyes in the first place. Just a bunch of spikes and grapple points mostly. I switched all the graphics settings including textures to low quality for these two sections of the game, which let me get back to 60 FPS thankfully. They were struggling so bad otherwise that I had feared even that wouldn't be enough to get smooth performance. Still have no idea how nothing else in the game suffers the same problem, but I'm glad for it. Let's talk gameplay now. I will not take too much time here covering the basics since you're more than likely already familiar with them if you're deep enough into video games to click on this video in the first place. You got your health, stamina, strength, dex and resonance stats. Each weapon you find has a light and a heavy attack, and each of them also scales with one or more of the strength, dex and resonance stat trio. The weapon variety is pretty good for the size of the game I'd say, and there's a little something for everyone to enjoy. You can also equip two weapons at once and switch between them on the fly, which is nice. The D-pad is for consumables regardless of whether they replenish as surrogates or not. As you can guess, surrogates are your bench fires for this game, and I'd say they're scattered around the map at a perfect frequency. Each area has 2 or 3 of them regardless of its size, but the distance you have to make in between surrogates never gets ridiculous despite that, because the larger areas have you unlock more shortcuts leading to the same surrogate, which also leads to more of those juicy neuron activations in your brain. There's a reason why levels with so many looping interconnected paths are so hot nowadays. It's simply just good game design. However, this is where I need to pause for a few criticisms. First of all, it's not like the D-pad being reserved for consumables is inherently a bad design decision or anything, but it certainly does not do the game's aforementioned lackluster first impression any favors when you see its slots empty at the start and get curious about what they're for, only to then discover that they're just for throwing knives and shit like any old Souls-like. What's worse is its implementation though. Instead of using the D-pad to cycle between the group of items put in each slot like Dark Souls for instance, you can only put one item in each slot here and the associated D-pad button just uses it instead of switching to something else. I assume this was done to simplify and streamline things a bit, but it unfortunately does does the exact opposite, leading to so much menu navigation just for swapping consumables. To add even more insult to injury, you can't even use most of these directly from the menu either. You have to equip one in a slot, exit the menu, and then use the D-pad button even if it's something you don't regularly use and just want to activate this one time. I'd say this could have been done so that your inventory screen pausing the game could not be abused to use everything safely, but each consumable item has a real-time animation upon use that can be cancelled by enemies anyway, so what's the point? Overall, I just don't vibe with this D-pad consumable system really. It doesn't feel like much thought was put into it compared to most other gameplay systems and mechanics in here. A relatively much more minor criticism I have has to do with the surrogate warping system that you unlock after beating a certain boss. As you may guess, it's not the ability to warp itself that I have a problem with since I'm not a masochist. It makes life so much easier after you unlock it, but leaves another system that was put in the game utterly useless. See, normally if you haven't unlocked the ability to warp between surrogates yet, your only option for fast traveling is through these things called nerve passes. These are not nearly as common as surrogates. Some areas don't even have a single one. This makes backtracking kind of brutal during the early game, as you may guess, and here's a fun fact. At some point, this was the only method of fast travel throughout the whole game. The surrogate warping was later added, I'm guessing due to overwhelming player feedback, with the colors of Road DLC, one of the many free expansions that were added to the game later. The problem this causes is that you can enter this DLC area way before you discover all of the nerve passes. The boss that rewards you with this ability is just at the entrance of the area, and it's kind of challenging to fight early on, but definitely very beatable still. I was able to do it, and I suck at video games, so you can probably do it as well. This leads to a situation where you have the ability to just freely warp between any surrogate during the whole second half of the game, but you still keep finding nerve passes as a natural result of exploring around, and each time you do so, it just ends up being totally pointless besides the achievement. They go from providing a huge sense of relief and accomplishment during the early game to a mere, oh, I found one of these again. Okay, because finding literally anything else would be more worthwhile at that point. It makes me kind of feel bad for them. On the other hand, the warping is a huge time saver that I wouldn't want to have to unlock later in the game either, so I don't know the perfect solution to this. Maybe a cost could have been added to warp among surrogates, or maybe only certain ones could have been warp points like in Dark Souls 1, so that the nerve passes closer to the remaining unwarpable surrogates could have remained useful. I don't know. With the fluff out of the way though, let's get to the real meat and potatoes of the game. The gameplay systems that actually set it apart from its contemporaries. Most importantly, the absorb mechanic. It serves as your best defensive and offensive option, especially at the beginning. There is such a huge emphasis put on this one, in fact, that you learn it even before getting a weapon and by extension your first basic attacks. What it does is that when you parry an enemy, you literally suck them in whole like the black hole you are, one-shotting them and filling up your breath meter. It's this glowing orange part, and there's a good reason for that color choice. It's your Estus, your main source of healing, and outside of a very few consumables, absorbing is the only way you can fill it up. This means that your survivability is directly tied to how well you parry here, not just because it makes you avoid damage, but also lets you heal more and instantly deals massive damage to the enemy the moment you successfully do it. It is ridiculous how powerful absorbing is, and it's therefore essential for the rest of the game to be designed and balanced around that, of course. This is where things get mixed in quality though, sometimes because of the game and sometimes because of the player. First of all, absorbing has to feel good, obviously. At the start of the game, it doesn't, but that's not the game's fault, unlike everything else at the beginning. After playing countless games with parry mechanics, my brain was hardwired to release dopamine at the clink clangs that took the 10th of a second instead of this mostly silent 2-second animation that plays whenever you absorb something. It felt deeply wrong for that to be the result of a parry. I thought it was incredibly unsatisfying at first compared to the usual loud and quick clash of two immense forces, and killed the pace of the game's combat because of how long it paused it. But as I had to use it more and more, I warmed up to it a lot. Fittingly, it has gravity. You're not just deflecting the enemy but pulling them apart, consuming them. It also works because parrying here never becomes this fast-paced rhythm game with long strings of combos, where only by the end of the whole thing do you feel satisfaction if you did it perfectly from start to end without taking damage even once from any part of it. Each individual parry has to take the fraction of a moment in that situation and have less emotional weight than the overall dance. Grime kinda does the opposite of this in the meanwhile, and is satisfying in its own way for it. When you're clinging to life by pixels lost in a cave with no clue as to where the next surrogate is, an enemy means something you can finally absorb to fill up your breath meter and heal just by parrying one attack. It perfectly incentivizes facing enemies head-on when you're at low health instead of trying to avoid them, especially because you don't even have to engage in this long back and forth dance with any of them. You just have to parry one attack. If you fail to pull it off, that's that, but if you succeed, that 2-second animation is the most satisfying thing in the world. You get relieved and invigorated, while your enemy that could have been your doom a second ago instantly crumbles to mere dust from full HP. Well, except it's not always that simple, which brings us to deflecting and grey health. As you keep progressing through the game, you come across more and more enemies with health bars that have multiple segments, some grey while some red. See, what absorbing actually does is not insta-kill basic enemies, but rather instantly deplete any red segment of their health bar. Grey segments in the meanwhile cannot be absorbed but only deflected using the same move, working like a regular parry mechanic. It only avoids damage without dealing it back and does not fill up your breath meter either. The next area you arrive after the caves called Litek actually gives a fantastic little tutorial for all this at the entrance before you actually begin exploring it for real. It first sends a dude your way with a single segment red health bar which you one-shot with absorb. Then it sends a dude whose health bar has a grey segment and a red segment. You first deflect his attacks and simply hit him to deplete his grey health, and then you get to absorb him once he drops to his red health. The last dude has 2 red segments, absorbing the first of which absorbs his shield and the second of which of course kills him. It's a great way to tutorialize how health bars work without relying on text prompts. From then on, the game does a lot of cool things with this system during its first half. Mini bosses have the first half of their health red and the second half grey, so the period in which you are trying to learn their attacks is less punishing. Not only can you replenish your breath during it for more heals if necessary, but your absorb also deals great damage to quickly melt down this first half. The second half is where the real challenge begins, as you know the attack patterns now but can no longer replenish your breath or deal massive damage with absorb. You can only deflect and attack. Have I also mentioned that deflecting or absorbing does not cost stamina but attacking does, by the way? It's just a really good system that the developers have used so smartly here, creating 2 phases for each mini-boss without having to change their attack patterns at all. It's the player who has to change their playstyle in the second phase and exercise more patience while still getting mileage out of the attack patterns they rememorized in the first phase. Main bosses on the other hand usually do the opposite of this. They have a grey first phase where their attack patterns are more manageable, but you have to stay patient and make do with what health and breath you have. Then in the second phase they get crazier, but you can also absorb them now, which means they'll go down much quicker compared to the first phase if you don't fail your parries, and can even replenish some of your breath for more heals if necessary. It's the complete opposite of the mini-boss design, but still works just as well for different reasons. I should also go over the trait system here, since it's yet another way in which the developers have incentivized using the absorb and deflect mechanics ingeniously. Firstly, to unlock any trait in the first place, you have to kill the basic enemy associated with that trait by absorbing them 5 times. And to actually use and upgrade these traits after unlocking them, you have to spend hunt points, which are collected by defeating any of the numerous special enemies scattered throughout the map. They're not basic enemies, but they're not bosses either. They're just built different, I guess. They don't get a name and a giant health bar at the bottom of the screen, but they're still one-time fights just like bosses. Unlike basic enemies, they do not respawn after you kill them once, and the reward is always a single hunt point, even though some are definitely much more challenging than others, like this motherfucker right here. They also usually have 4 or 5 segments, with 2 small ones being red. It's to give a little bit of an out if you're in a tight spot, but if you're not and your remaining breath is more than enough, you can also just simply beat them to a pulp with your attacks. It's again just good design. But then we get to the latter half of the game, and what starts to happen is almost non-stop grey health and red attack pornography. Red attack meaning that it cannot be absorbed or deflected at all, by the way. You have to dodge it or else. And so it begins. Enemy after enemy after enemy unable to be absorbed at all. Bosses with both health bars completely grey, and even bosses with 1 bar grey and 1 bar red, but the red bar still only able to be deflected for some reason, even though the game had so far established it otherwise. I got the feeling that this was done because with the breath capacity upgrades and certain traits, you can easily turn into a powerhouse in the late game that can sustain itself quite well for the most part without having to rely on absorbing so much. You get 3 full meters of breath, the statue you leave behind upon dying, which can be broken to heal a good amount during your next attempt, better healing from your breath thanks to certain traits, a few consumables that replenish your breath, and even a separate healing consumable that replenishes at surrogates. All of this without without even taking into account how much you can increase your maximum HP through just traits and armor set bonuses, let alone upgrading your vitality stat. When this is the case, I do kind of understand the game letting you absorb less and less as time goes on, but like maybe don't make it the case in the first place then. How about instead of Dark Souls 2ing your game with healing options, you just stick to your decision at the start of keeping absorb as the end all be all for healing. Then the game could actually get harder as you progress while keeping the usage of its most important mechanic uncompromised. As it is, the game just acts scared at the end of letting you absorb things despite how much it was emphasizing and incentivizing it earlier. It's terrified of it making things potentially too easy, even though there's already a great mid to late game optional boss which proves that it does not have to be the case. Misbegotten Amalgam is a rematch against the first boss of the game, now more powerful with deadlier attacks and a larger health bar in a more hazardous arena. I love it when games do this, by the way. An actually challenging version of the pushover tutorial boss is always fun to see. Anyways, this boss normally only throws out unblockable red attacks like most later bosses, and you can definitely beat it by just dodging them and attacking whenever you get an opening, even though it would be a totally unfun slog of a fight with how much health it has. However, what you can instead do is pull on its eye. I haven't gone over it earlier, but pull is an ability you get early in the game that lets you pull certain objects out of the ground for platforming sections. It can also be used against enemies whenever they flash yellow for a moment like a pullable object. This interrupts the enemy's current attack and pulls basic enemies towards you while briefly staggering boss enemies. What it causes Misbegotten Amalgam to do though is throw a temper tantrum where you can, guess what, absorb one of its hands on either side, which actually deals good damage compared to the tickles you call your attacks. Also, the eye only becomes pullable for a brief period after a barrage of unblockable red attacks, which means that to pull this off you have to avoid a good number of deadly red attacks by jumping and dashing, catch the window to pull on the eye, and then parry the resulting temper tantrum for a successful absorb. I'd say the resulting chunk of damage and the breath refill you get is more than deserved, and the game ends up having tested you for a variety of things you have learned up to that point. Now compare that to Shapely Fidus, a mandatory boss who cannot be absorbed but only deflected during his first phase and cannot be absorbed or deflected during his second phase. He's not a bad or unfun boss when you look at him in a vacuum. I even enjoyed fighting him more than some of the more gimmicky fights like Surrogate Vulture for instance, which feels more like a platforming challenge than a boss. However, when you consider the game that he's put in, Shapely Fidus is questionably designed at best, because he could have just been put in any game at all. He could be a Dark Souls boss with how much dodging you have to do compared to anything else, and that's especially disappointing because unlike most of this game's rogues gallery, he's actually humanoid besides the giant hand for a head, about the same as your size, and just wields a sword. This is supposed to be the best boss of the game. The giant twisted ballsack I fight in some fuck-ass poison cave is not supposed to be a better boss than the slow-walking, sword-wielding monologue enthusiast I fight in his fucking throne room. Was this game designed by aliens? Have they ever played a video game before? Who the fuck makes the most humanoid boss in their game with parries the least parryable boss? Who does that? I get that the average parry in this game is stronger than its counterparts in any other, whether you absorb or deflect with it, so design the encounter around that and let me parry the fucking sword guy instead of making me run around him like a headless chicken while you let me parry an actual giant headless chicken like that's the motherfucker I need to do that to. I swear to god, if this also ends up being the case in the second game as well, I'm going to turn the development studio into a grime scene. I quickly want to also talk about a specific mini-boss called the Artisan of Flesh. I believe this fight was supposed to be as vertical as it was horizontal with how many different platforms at various heights and grappling points are present in the arena. For me though, I'm not sure if it's because I ended up unintentionally exploiting his AI or something, but the whole thing just ended up taking place on the bottom floor after he teleported there. He just stuck to this floor, always moving between the two ends of it and never going back up again, which made him unbelievably easy to defeat for me with his health pool also being so low. I was even expecting it to be a fake out and a surprise second phase to start, but it didn't. It was just so baffling for the mini-boss that easily hypes himself up the most by far to then become the pinwheel of the game for me basically. Let me know down in the comments if this happened to you as well, because I'm genuinely still trying to figure out if he's supposed to be a joke or not. His demeanor is kinda funny already even before the fight. I know I have gone over some big positives and negatives so far, and it might have made the game sound like more of a mixed bag or an overall mediocre experience rather than the great one I mentioned at the start, but keep in mind that everything I have skipped over so far or only complimented briefly without going into into detail, ranges from perfectly serviceable to really fun. The platforming, for instance, is something that I did not comment on, and that's because it's just good. It doesn't blow your mind with anything never been done before, but it definitely serves its purpose without any hiccups and ends up being enjoyable the whole way. Same with the art direction and the music. It's just great for the most part, while some parts I'd say are even stellar. There's just a baseline quality to everything here besides the stuff I most harshly criticized, is what I'm trying to say. I think the order system's cool, and I very much welcome the low punishment for dying. I also like that there are no runbacks. Thank fuck there are no runbacks. I'm seriously so sick of them and every CBT slave on the internet who thinks they're good for whatever reason. You might have noticed that I didn't even really tear into any specific boss in this game. Even Shapely Fidus is again a completely enjoyable fight as is. It just so easily could have been made much better and fit more the game that it was put in. Same with all the other bosses I criticized for having too many red attacks or only having grey health bars. I don't truly overall dislike any boss in this game. Even the fights I care for the least do at least something interesting with the presentation or serve the narrative well, and I cannot emphasize just how rare that is in a game for me. Even Sekiro has bosses that I outright hate full stop with all of my being. With all that being said, it's time to get into major spoilers. You may come back later after playing the game if you decided on doing so, or skip to this time frame to avoid them. I'm going to talk about the story in this section mostly, with still a few minor comments on the gameplay elements of a couple of bosses, mainly the final one and the one just before that. I am going to give one last 3-second countdown for you all to leave before I dive into it. Here goes. I'm not going to dissect or even simply go over everything in the story, not only because this video is already long enough, but also because not all of it is that important or interesting in my opinion anyway. None of it's bad by any means, but there's just a lot of fluff alongside the essential reading material here, which is what I'm going to stick to. The most important thing to know here is that this world is essentially the body of a god that seems to be either dying or already dead, with its inhabitants essentially being the parasites or the maggots feasting on it. They don't just look so malformed and disgusting to reflect that though. They're also literally cursed, I'm guessing for what they're doing to this god's body, with what's called the old pain. What it does is make them feel that they're wrong. It's a deeply rooted feeling in their chest that their mere existence is a crime. Their physical malformations are merely the amplifier rather than the source of this old pain. It is something that they can't ever truly get rid of, but only trick themselves into believing that they have. The citizens of Litik just try to ignore it but barely can. The hate, self-loathing and hostility resurfaces the moment a Carven appears at their doorstep. You're not a Carven though, they just mistake you for one. The Carven are actually those that literally carve their bodies to look less malformed and imperfect in a futile attempt to get rid of the old pain, but again it always remains. They also hate you because they know of your true nature as the end giver, sent here to put this dying world out of its misery. They don't want to be destroyed just because it's miserable here though. Who are you to make that decision for them? And who are you to lay even a finger on everything they have managed to build despite their suffering? The Carven Palace is still hostile, cold and brutal, but it is much more orderly and impressive than the cramped caverns of Litik, barely even decorated to make into a worthwhile living space. The Carven are ambitious and proud, unlike the depressed and complacent Litik folk. Standing tall above all of them though is Shidra of the World Pillar, this wise old badass who acts as your main guide throughout the game and also upgrades your weapons. He's the first person you meet that knows of your true nature and acts without hostility despite that, even if he's a bit cold and bitter. A demeanor that only intensifies as the game progresses and you get closer to your goal of putting an end to this world. He keeps guiding and aiding you until the very end despite his visible resentment of doing so, and so you wonder what his true motivations are. Maybe despite looking like the only authority figure around here, he's on some even higher power's leash being forced to do this. He clearly does not want this world to be destroyed and even outright says so multiple times. So what's the deal with him? Well, as you probably already guessed if you played a video game in your life before, Shidra ends up being the final boss of the game. I mean, you see a guy designed like this with even his house looking like an arena already, and it's not even a matter of predicting that you're gonna fight him as much as wondering if there's a way to avoid it and spare him. And that is his exact gambit. Shidra had already known from the start that there was no stopping you by force, so he assessed whether you could be talked out out of your objective instead. He noticed that despite your appearance, you were not merely an indifferent force of nature. You listened and made decisions. You had a consciousness and perhaps even a conscience within you. Maybe when the time arrived, you could make the decision to disobey even your purpose for existing in the first place and spare this world. The end will come for it sooner or later anyway, but you do not have to be the perpetrator. It does not have to be by your hand. If you followed what I summarized so far, you'll likely cut on to some familiar patterns. The main dilemma here is even more Souls-like than the rest of the game. It's straight up, will you link the fire or not? I think the reason behind why so many games deal with this question without it ever getting old or stale for me is the fact that it just applies to basically everything in our lives. Everyone and everything we know has an expiration date. It will all end someday, and every once in a while that expiration date makes itself very apparent for a thing or two around us. Is it better to hold on to what you've known and loved until now, even if it hurts and sometimes even feels cruel to do so, or is it better to just let it end and cherish the memories instead? I'm talking about literally anything here, by the way. It could be a person in your life, it could be an object, a piece of art, a tradition, a project, an idea, a hobby, a way of life, a community, or anything else. No matter what, the question of whether you should hold on for however longer you can or just let go will always come up at some point. And there is no objectively right or wrong answer most of the time. What's worth preserving and what's not comes down to what you think or feel is best. It's the same case by case basis with each of these fictional game worlds as well, at least for me personally. Rather than being an I'm just going to pick what I always pick anyway situation, I might choose to preserve one dying world in a game and put it out of its misery in another based on what it made me feel and how strongly. I don't think there's a definitive good or bad ending here, but there is just one where you fight Shidra, of course, so let's talk about that. First of all, it sure as hell beats what almost every Souls-like and Metroidvania I've ever played has for its final boss. Some ultimate deity, legendary figure, the literal embodiment of evil or whatever the fuck that for the most part has only been hyped up by other characters in the game to varying degrees rather than being a character itself. There's a reason why no matter how many times you repeat to me that he's the most important guy there ever was, and however many plin plons you put in the background, Gwyn's fight at the end of Dark Souls 1 just does not hit as hard as Sif's after the DLC. There's something personal going on there between the boss and the player character, and by extension the player. Something lived rather than just told. Fighting the most badass guy that ever existed is cool and all, but the only way I'll ever get emotionally invested in that alone is if the fight is ball-crushingly hard and I have something to prove to myself. And considering that my patience for such challenges depletes more and more as the years go by and my life gets busier, it's no surprise that I much prefer fights that I'll get emotionally invested in because of the character I'm fighting rather than the difficulty. Shidra's fight provides both. It's like if you had to fight the Firekeeper if you chose to let the flame die in a Souls game and it turned out she's actually got hands. Not like Frida or Fume Knight hands, but more like Ornstein and Smo hands. It doesn't get your face red from tearing up or from fuming, but it's still a somber duel and the difficulty is still higher here than any other boss in the game, I'd say. There's also the fact that even as he's fighting you, Shidra still knows it's a lost cause at the end. He's only doing it to survive as long as he can, for however many more minutes he can let this world have. It's good shit. My problem with this finale though is that it makes him look stupid during the actual fight since none of his attacks are actually targeted at you. He's essentially just creating the same arena hazards over and over without tracking your current position at all like a proper dynamic boss battle. It just kind of breaks your immersion during a fight that would otherwise have every reason for you to be invested in it. But then you realize that Shidra is just mindlessly going through the same motions over and over like you're not even there. Everything he throws out always spawning and landing on the same place. And don't get me wrong, none of the bosses in the game are that smart, but they at least have some sort of basic AI that detects where you are and attacks in that direction for the most part. There are instances in some where it feels like they become stupid for a moment, but none of them are as egregious as Shidra is, especially when you take into account the very brief quote-unquote second phase during which he just starts throwing a mindless tantrum, once again with no regard to where you're actually standing. You can even just chill in the corner and heal comfortably while he keeps doing his thing like he's fighting ghosts. If it wasn't for this, what comes after would actually be a great moment by itself, that is absorbing all of his hands one by one. He doesn't even bother to move them away anymore even after you easily absorb one. He just kinda miserably keeps going because he's completely given up by now, too tired to resist any longer and willing to just let you end it already. And his thanks to you after it's all over for however much time you've given them to exist is just a cherry on top. It's a good finale for the game despite its flaws that could have been truly great if only a little more thought had gone into the actual fight itself, but the finale for this section of the video is another story. There is a section of the game that I intentionally skipped over before as I wanted to save its excellence for last. The section that comes after the Carven Palace and before the final confrontation with Shidra, an area called the Cenotaph City. Before you make your way here, Shidra informs you that for the first time since your arrival, you will be welcomed with cheers and open arms by adoring worshippers of you. The first thought that comes to your mind due to what the player character is and what this world is like might be some crazy death cult sacrificing orphans to summon this eldritch devourer of worlds that will hopefully make them immortal for their deeds while the rest of the world crumbles or something like that. But what you find instead is not only unlike anything else in this game, but also unlike anything else I've seen in any Souls-like or Metroidvania so far. It is an aesthetic antithesis to all of those dark, grimy, ruined vistas, ironically in a game called Grime of all things. The Cenotaph City is a truly thriving utopic metropolis, bustling with joyous and welcoming people occupying themselves with various forms of art. No one among the spotless gold and marble walls is hostile to you. No one is miserable like the residents of Litek or ill-tempered like the Carven. Everyone is excited to meet you, showering you with the kinds of gifts you'd normally be rewarded with for beating a hard section in any other area. They kindly guide you as you explore around, showing you the way to the surrogate, the beacon and the nerve pass. They show you their statues and paintings, hoping that you'll find them worthy of being destroyed. These people call themselves the Coda because they want to be exactly that, and they call their city Cenotaph because they want it to be exactly that. The Coda are the only people you meet in the game with perfect humanoid shapes, the types of figures that everyone outside the city looks up to. Theoretically, if anyone is to be free from the old pain, it should be them, and they truly seem like they are. But as you quickly realize, that's only because they have fully embraced it instead of ignoring, resenting or rejecting it like the others. The Coda welcome the end and only concern themselves with being memorable to you. They know that there is no stopping your destruction or turning you away from it. They have already accepted their end and are solely concerned with whether or not they can go out with the biggest bang possible. All of these monuments, these paintings, this whole city was built to be the most memorable thing destroyed by you. Every piece of art you destroy is a badge of honor for its artist, and every little thing you absorb into that black hole is a sight to behold. That prophesized end giver is finally here at full display, and what else to do than give him what he loves most before the lights go out. The only encounter in Cenotaph City is the final performance, a boss fight that I find a bit gimmicky and more of a platforming challenge than a boss at times, but it does also have relatively long stretches where it's just a one-on-one no bullshit duel with the main performer too. Overall, it is mechanically not the best fight in the game, but mostly good, which does not really matter at all. How this fight plays out is just thematically so perfect regardless of its gameplay, and its presentation is so impeccable with the elegant performer, the perfectly coordinated dancers and this grandiose climactic orchestral music that it would have to be as bad to play as the Bed of Chaos or something for me to even begin to dislike it. It's such an amazing final crescendo to what's easily the best part of the game, and once it's over, the performer politely takes a bow as everyone applauds, stating that it's been an honor and they hope it's been as memorable as they'd hoped. Then we do our thing and it's all reduced to ruin in a second. Not a soul remaining, but only an unforgettable memory just as they had wished for. They accomplished their goal. Indeed, I destroyed everything at the end, and this was easily the most memorable part of the game. It was even what convinced me to make a full video on it. It was this game's crowning achievement, the ashtray maze of this experience that would add a full point or two by itself if I was to score it out of 10. Cenotaph City is how Grime sets itself apart from its contemporaries, crafting similar narratives and asking similar questions. It brings forth the other side of the equation. It's one thing to put you in the shoes of the one with the power to decide whether the world should end or be preserved for however longer, and another to show you such extreme ends of how its citizens would deal with it. Imagine if a foreign entity descended upon Earth with the mission to eradicate humanity and all it has ever built because it is a cancer on the planet that needs to be rooted out. It is also supposedly just to put you out of your misery quicker, so you should be thankful if anything. How do you deal with that? The foreigner is not an unconscious force of nature but a thinking being, so do you try to appease it? Make like Shidra and attempt to befriend it to the best of your abilities so that it may perhaps by some miracle listen to you? Do you you try to show it that humans wish to keep existing for however longer despite their constant misery? Do you give in to your hatred for it, for daring to give itself the right to decide your fate in the first place, and so you scream at it and go out fighting despite knowing its futility because your pride keeps you from reacting in any other way? Or do you do what the Coda do? Do you build wonders, the kind of which were never built even when humanity wasn't doomed, all in the vain hope that maybe this almighty being could find it somewhat impressive despite how it scoffed at humanity's every other achievement so far? Do you collaborate with those like-minded to put all your time into crafting and creating the most beautiful things human eyes have ever seen, knowing that it will all be destroyed tomorrow? Do you rehearse over and over for one final display to show the best of humanity before it's gone, so that it may at least stand out to the stranger who will remain as the only ever witness that you were even here in the first place? Maybe, just maybe, it may find that final performance worthy to talk about after, and humanity could still get to live on as tales told among the stars. Is there a greater honor possible? Grime is a flawed but still excellent game for me. It definitely deserves more eyes on and more discussions around it. The developers engage with the community in such a positive way as well from what I've seen. Happy to take feedback and improve according to it. They released several free expansions to Grime after its release and before starting work on the second game. Some of these added much needed quality of life features to the game, like the aforementioned surrogate warping system, as well as the sprinting and hovering abilities that makes platforming and traversal much less painful. More challenge was added through these DLCs too though, such as the Path of Pain equivalent Abandoned Opus I mentioned early in the video, as well as an NG Plus mode that's a vastly different experience from New Game apparently. I can't comment on its quality since finishing one playthrough was enough for me, but I really appreciate the effort put into it from what I've heard. Lastly, I also appreciate that Grime manages to tell a complete story in itself with no sequel baiting or cliffhanger, wrapping everything up quite well at the end, especially if you pick the destruction ending. But it still ends in a way that leaves a very welcome possibility for future sequels, since this is just one world like this from what we can see in the final scene. A second game could easily take place in a different world or even maybe across multiple to expand on the first game's foundations. Regardless, I'm now fairly excited to see what Grime 2 does. If it manages to build upon what was already great here to make it even better, along with fixing its major issues like the intro slog and the grey health red attack pornography of the late game, I can see it genuinely being one of the best in this genre. Until next time, as always, take care of yourselves and thank you for watching.